Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Rachel Adams. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programs here at the Bemis Center. And so thrilled to see such a wonderful audience. And thank you again to Jennifer for that amazing gallery tour, wherever Jennifer is. Oh, there you are. As you may know, we have, in addition to Jennifer's exhibition up, we have Presence in the Pause, Interiority and Its Radical Imminence. These exhibitions are on view until September 17th, so there's plenty of time, and we're going to have a couple more amazing programs going on throughout the summer. So please make sure to pick up one of these gallery guides, which lists all of our programs, as well as an interview that Jennifer and I did for her show, and an essay that I wrote about the Presence in the Pause exhibition. After tonight, we actually have a little bit of a break, which never happens, so I look forward to not seeing you, but seeing you soon. Our next program is going to happen on July 13th, and that is the first of 3 public assemblies that are going to be co-facilitated by Jamie Ho and Caitlin Cass, who are both area artists. So please check out our website. All of those are now listed there. You can read about what they'll be talking about. And it's a sort of discussion-based assembly, and it'll be really amazing. So make sure to come for that. And then our next low-end performance will be with Maria Chavez on July 20th. So I know that feels like a long time away, but I'm sure it'll come by really quickly. Maria is also going to be joined by a longtime collaborator, Jordy Wheeler, for part of her set, so that's really exciting. And then finally, July 22nd is our open house, open studios for our summer residents, many of who are in the audience tonight. So as some of you know, we will open the entire building up. You'll get to meet our residents. We'll have an art activity. I will give a tour of the exhibitions. There will be ice cream. Thank you, Ted and Wally's. So make sure to mark your calendar for July 20th. Okay. I just want to give a shout out to our partner for the evening, and I'm just gonna open my phone real quick. We invited the Asian Community and Cultural Center from Lincoln to come down, or up, I still don't know, and to set up a table, so please feel free to chat with them after the talk. The Asian Community and Cultural Center supports and empowers all refugees and immigrants through programs and services, and advances the sharing of Asian culture and the other cultural heritages of our clients with the community at large. They've been a partner with us in the past, and we're really happy to welcome them here again. And they are having an amazing Harvest Moon Festival September 30th, so some of you who live in the area, make sure to mark your calendars for that, and you can talk to Sheila and the crew after the talk about it. Thank you, Sheila, for being here. So many things. Okay, but tonight we are here to hear a talk by Anna Storti, Dr. Anna Storti, I should say, If Porcelain Had a Race, Racial Abstraction and the Asian White Thing. Just a quick bio on Dr. Anna Storti. She is the Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University, where she also teaches in the Asian American and Diaspora Studies program, and is affiliated with the Asian Pacific Studies Institute and Critical Asian Humanities. An interdisciplinary scholar trained in feminist theory and queer of color critique, Storti explores the aesthetic and affective relations between race, empire, violence, and pleasure, specializing in art and culture across the Asian diaspora. She's currently at work on her first book, which asks what the growing population of mixed-race white and Asian Americans elucidates about intimacy, violence, and the permanence of war. This is also her first visit to Omaha, so we're really happy. Thank you, Jennifer, for suggesting her coming, and welcome, Dr. Anna Storti.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's really such an honor to be speaking at the Bima Center. And I feel like before I get started, I want to just begin with some thanks. I feel like Rachel, Jared, and everyone has made my trip here feel seamless and kind of fun also, which is not easy work. I think it's just really an indication of a kind of care, vision, generosity, thoughtfulness for what it takes to do this work, to which you all are rock stars. So a big thanks to everyone here. And for the showing, it's nice to see people. Admittedly, I've been excited, looking forward to this talk for a couple months now. Not only am I a self-professed fangirl of Jennifer Ling Dachik's work, but I've been having ideas, and I've been wanting to have conversations about those ideas with people. So I know we just had, at least many of us who are here, a very invigorating tour. And I know that this portion of the evening is a lecture, but I hope to leave like a good amount of time, 15 minutes or so, to maybe have a back and forth. So hopefully it's not just me talking at you the entire time. Of course, if there are questions that arise for you, especially those who might be joining on the live stream, you can feel free to email me on the email address on the slide. So this talk is titled, If Porcelain Had a Race. And by the end, I'd like to have left you with a deeper understanding of racial abstraction, Asian American feminist theory, and a close reading of Dachik's oeuvre, which I use as a point of reference to answer a rather odd question. If porcelain had a race, would it be Asian or white? And I may be not the only person who I may not be the only person who thinks that this is an odd question for the deceptively simple reason that race is not oftentimes used as a descriptor for things. Like porcelain, race, as we know, is instead one of the many ways that humans have thought to differentiate the complexities of the human condition, which is to say that race exists within the realm of identity, and it's objects that have identities, not people, or so we're taught. It goes without saying, though, that race to some is seen as a divisive and touchy subject, something that we might have been taught to not talk about at the dinner table. Even now, only 3 summers after the racial reckoning of 2020, talks of race in the mainstream lead one to believe that race and difference writ large are problems to be solved. Like gender, sexuality, class, nationality, and ability, race and ethnicity are attributes associated with human life and human difference, and there are structural forces at play that encourage us to deny difference, to buy into the idea that we are all of the human race, to not belabor on race, or to, in other words, not see color. So there have been entire fields of study devoted to interrogating racial categories as not inherently given or biological, but as socially constructed. And while I don't have the time in this lecture to get into the kind of nuances across the fields, interdisciplinary fields ranging from critical race theory to ethnic studies to more kind of pointed critiques on racist science, biological racism, and eugenics, I do want to acknowledge just briefly that the reasons why these fields are under attack right now, as we're seeing with the College Board, AP testing, and the specific assault on Black studies, the reasons why these knowledges are under attack are because they endeavor to bring their students to a more comprehensive understanding of how race is woven into systems of repression like colonialism, empire, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, which are systems that these fields don't consider as under question, but as conditions of our reality that impact us all, albeit differently. So possessing a knowledge of race, power, and resistance is seen to be a radical act, and thus is rendered a threat to the systems at play, because, as Robin D.G. Kelly has recently noted in an interview that I really recommend that he had on The New Yorker, no matter what policies and procedures and legislation are implemented, the structure of racism, embedded in a capitalist system, embedded in a system of patriarchy, continues to create wealth for some and make the rest of our lives precarious. So at base, race is a subject with real implications. So when I ask if porcelain had a race, I seek not to ascribe porcelain a racial identity or to make an abstract claim with abstract stakes in light of a of a matter that, like race, has real life, life and death consequences. Rather, I'm interested in how an object like porcelain, this quintessential imperial thing, and one of the most coveted trade items, has actually functioned as a method of racialization in itself. How has an object like porcelain animated Asian femininity and white femininity? How, to phrase it differently, is one's personhood contingent on their objecthood? This approach to race, the human condition, and the things that may or may not describe us leads us into the theoretical territory of fetishization, aesthetics, and orientalism. But before we traverse these terrains over the next 40 minutes or so, let me first offer some background as to how I first came to question porcelain's race. So porcelain is it originated in China in the 10th century and played an integral role in imperial trade when it was introduced into Europe through Asian imports in the 14th century. Coveted by the West for its pure white color, porcelain and its ascension into a global luxury item spurred this chase by Europeans to discover the secrets mastered by the Chinese for how to work with porcelain in spite of its seemingly impossible properties, both strong and delicate, impenetrable yet receptive to color. Renowned as white gold, porcelain is a type of clay famous for its durability, malleability, and translucent shine. The material, a white vitrified ceramic known as china, is formed by firing a mixture of two minerals extracted from the earth. Kaolin, a white clay known as the bones of porcelain, which is seen on the left, and patoons, which is a raw rock material known as the flesh. The white bones are more difficult to find and are thus more prized than the raw flesh. To produce high-grade porcelain, bones and flesh are to be mixed in equal proportion, but to produce everyday wear, the mixture requires only 1/3 bone to 2/3 flesh. So the process of making porcelain, in other words, is contingent upon a tactile relation and intimacy between bone and flesh, white and color. I first decided to research porcelain when I came across Jennifer Ling Dachuk's work. I was still in graduate school and I was writing my dissertation, just starving for something other than my dissertation to think about. So I decided to go into this deep dive on porcelain. I was fascinated by the process of vitrification, the ways and the technique needed to glaze and decorate this delicate yet strong thing, and of course the imperial fixation on the whiteness. I especially became captivated with what Dachuk was doing with ceramics, fusing porcelain, flesh, and hair in ways that not only brought me to consider femininity and labor, feminist maker culture and craft, but the way that common household items like a porcelain dish can offer context into the complex relationships that arise when we consider embodiment and domesticity alongside each other. So what I noticed in Dachuk's approach was that she somehow managed to unfold for me the spaces between subject and object that would assume their easy distinction. Western philosophers, psychoanalysts, some feminists too have long surmised that there exists this distinction between the subject and the object. We come to oftentimes understand the object by what it's not, which is a subject. The object is an it, whereas the subject is me or you. The subject-object divide and related dichotomies have generated no dearth of theoretical debate, seen perhaps most in the Cartesian mind-body split, which takes the subject-object divide into gendered territory, such that the mind is masculine and the body is feminine. The mind is seen to be objective, productive, whereas the body is excess to be consumed. But there was something about the way Dachuk works with porcelain that caused me to wonder about the forms of relation that might open up if we depart the subject-object divide, the or in questioning is one a subject or an object, in favor of that and, what I see to be an adhesive and that links the subject and object together in conversation, but also in materiality, as we see here on the slide. So this image is from Dachuk's 2014 solo exhibition, Dark and Lovely, which includes a video where the artist plucks her eyebrows bare in just under 7 minutes. After the plucking is complete, Dachuk fastens detachable prosthetic porcelain casted eyebrows above her eyes. She makes the synthetic porcelain mimic the organic hair. Porcelain, an object, rests on the skin surface, covering over Datsuk's vacant follicles. And in the end, this colorful congealment exposes a relation to porcelain's prosthetics as detachable artifice and object, where the skin surface becomes the site where subject and object become one in spite of their difference. So I began to read the formal elements of Datsuk's work with race in mind, and what I found was that by refusing the subject-object divide in favor of the oneness that emerges when the subject and object are held together, we come to recognize the ways in which some forms of subjectivity, so some forms of personhood, are fastened to a type of object life, whether or not one dons porcelain brows, which I would love to do one day, maybe without the plucking. So let's spend some time on this idea. In addition to its tangible material form, porcelain has come to reference light and unblemished skin. And this happened soon after porcelain was introduced into Europe in the 14th century, as the term came to reference a white woman's fair and unblemished skin. Today, porcelain skin denotes a translucent look with a hint of yellow or pink undertones. And people with porcelain skin are understood to have flawless, even-toned skin, with no dark spots or discoloration, and it's expected that the skin is fair or white. It's kind of coveted to have porcelain skin. But when I see the blue added to the white base of porcelain, as it is in classic Chinese ceramic work, I get the sense that both colors act as an adhesive, wetting the ceramic surface to connotations of Asian femininity in particular. In spite of its literal whiteness, when we consider porcelain's origins and its features, delicate, oriental object, it seems to deliver a stereotypical rendition of Asian women. If then porcelain lives this corporeal life, is that life more white or Asian? So to begin answering this question, we can find direction in the study of racial abstraction, which is a topic at the intersection of studies on race, art, and aesthetics. So by way of a definition, racial abstraction signifies a mode of non-figurative representation where race is captured not only in reference to the material reality, so not only in reference to the body, but through symbols or things like porcelain. So as rooted in the body as it is, race can be abstracted from the human and projected onto objects or concepts. And the study of racial abstraction endeavors to kind of chart the implications of this transfer. So as an example, we can think back to the 2016 TED Talk by Black feminist theorist Brittany Cooper, who examined racism through the lens of time. I'm curious, has anyone watched this TED Talk? Okay, it's a must. It's very, very good. So in this TED Talk, she details how time has been stolen from people of color, resulting in lost moments of joy and connection, lost years of health or equality of life, even kind of the hold-up or long waiting period for racial progress. So she declares that if time had a race, it would be white. White people own time. And then she goes quickly on to say that such incendiary statements can maybe make people feel uncomfortable. And she writes, haven't we moved past the point where race really matters? Isn't race a heavy-handed concept? How will we ever get over racism if we keep talking about race? Perhaps we should lock up our concepts of race in a time capsule, bury them and dig them up in 1,000 years, peer at them with the clearly more enlightened, raceless versions of ourselves that belong to the future. But you see there, and this is still Cooper, that desire to mitigate the impact of race and racism shows up in how we attempt to manage time, in the ways we narrate history, in the ways we attempt to shove the negative truths of the present into the past. So time, like porcelain, is a concept not often thought of in racial terms, but by claiming there is a temporal quality to time and that it is white, Cooper not only offers an understanding of the racial politics of time, but she models the type of generative theoretical exercises that emerge from the study of racial abstraction. So to better understand racial abstraction in the context of the question at hand, let's consider Professor Leslie Bowe's most recent book, Racist Love, Asian Abstraction and the Pleasures of Fantasy. Here, Bowe develops the concept of racist love as a means to describe the ways anxiety can transform into pleasure. and specifically how racialized anxieties leveled against Asian people, like the yellow peril myth, the idea that Asians are perpetual foreigners or that they're model minorities, how these anxieties, these racialized fears, can actually be felt within the realm of desire. For Bo, Asian fetishism is the quintessential form of racist love, as one might assume, but her interest in the Asian fetish lies not in its object or practice, but in the alternative stories and perhaps discomfiting affective stances generated by its disavowal. So what happens when we don't talk about it? So attending to these alternative stories and feelings, she considers anti-Asian racism through racial abstraction, which is to say, she focuses her study not on Asian people, but on an assortment of Asianized things, anthropomorphic objects or images, showing how, through abstraction, these things might function as conduits for political desires surrounding Asian people. And I know this might seem kind of convoluted, but it may surprise you how many things Bo discusses that may be familiar to you. Consider Ukuni, one of the characters in Cars 2. Has anyone seen Cars 2? I've only seen Cars 1, so I didn't get to meet her. There's also the popular children's book series, The Berenstain Bears, and this specific story on the Berenstains' new neighbors, panda bears, to which Papa Bear is skeptical, if not disgruntled, about what the panda bears are doing in their neighborhood. Says Papa, looking out the window. Now who do you suppose they are? He added in a grumpy tone of voice. And what do you suppose they're doing here? There is also the Italian brand Alessi and its Mandarin citrus squeezer. And of course, the artificially intelligent robots that emerge in films like Ex Machina, Cloud Atlas, and the documentary How to Build a Human. So if fetishism names a displacement of desire and fantasy onto alternative objects or body parts, these Asianized proxies unveil a fetishistic attraction where Asian people, as racialized subjects, transform into objects of anxiety, an anxiety that then morphs into a feeling of pleasure or attraction. Made into cute, beautiful, and maybe even sometimes unthreatening things, these Asianized proxies produce distance from the racialized fears or violence that too often surround Asian people. One might have, the citrus squeezer in their house, but might not actually want to share a dinner table with an Asian person. So with Asian abstraction, a dynamic of desire and consumption manifests. What might it mean to explore our love for such iconic racialized things? How is racial resentment cloaked by this love, this racist love? As much as racial abstraction, which, like abstraction in art, refuses overt references to materiality, paying close attention to racialized things and non-human objects reveals the political and affective complexities that underpin racial hierarchies. And for what it's worth, racial abstraction is in fact not confined to the abstract realm of philosophical inquiry, but actually, to me, invites an extraordinarily timely reckoning with the murderous life and fraught pleasures of Asian fetishization. So to this, we have only to recall as one example, the Atlanta shootings 2 years ago when 8 lives were lost, 6 of them Asian women, when a Southern Baptist man with a sex addiction sought to eliminate his temptations, the objects of his desire. The murders occurred within a larger surge of anti-Asian violence sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic and its racist rhetoric. But what was left out of much of the mainstream news reporting about this case in particular was how the shootings were indicative of a deeper imperial history, where Asian people have been subject to violence and hypersexualization because of xenophobic fears, which, for centuries, have perceived Asians as threats to white domesticity. So you can recall the Page Act of 1875, the first restrictive federal immigration law in the United States, which effectively prohibited the entry of Chinese women due to this idea that they were sexual deviants who contained diseases. So at the time, the American Medical Association actually believed that Chinese immigrants carried distinct germs to which they were immune, but from which whites would die if exposed. So this fear became concentrated onto Chinese women because some white Americans believed that germs and disease could most easily be transmitted to white men through the labor of Chinese sex workers. So there's this long history of conflation between the sexualization and the objectification of Asian women that persists to this day. You may have heard, I don't know if anyone's heard about the case that broke late last week, where a 30-year-old white American man attempted to sexually assault 2 Asian women, and when they refused and fought back, he pushed them down a cliff where they fell, one to their death. And they had just graduated from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with degrees in computer science. So there are, quite frankly, just too many dehumanizing, just devastating cases like this to recount. And so if you're wondering at this juncture what this violence, this history has to do with porcelain and racial abstraction, we have only to recall that abstraction, more generally, asks us to think about what it means to encourage kind of a distance from representation, a freedom from representation, which allows for an alternative entry point into the ways a person can morph into an object. Through abstraction, we can see how race itself can be transportable, operating as an associative sign symbol freed from the human body. So abstracted Asianness denotes a style, an aesthetic, an object. And this can be all fun and games when it comes to cartoons and kitchen appliances, but it can also be a matter of life and death when some people are quite literally viewed as representative of diseases or objects, temptations to eliminate. What happens then when Asianness, considered through the lens of racial abstraction, denotes not only a person, but a style? As fabulous as any style may be, it is still always subject to critique, to distaste. It can be preferred and discarded or rendered out of style, never not subject to the force of violence. So this notion that Asianness, and in particular Asian femininity, can be transportable as an associative sign is a central tenet to an emerging direction in feminist theory, which we'll trace through Anne Enlin Cheng's concept of ornamentalism, a theory exploring the entanglement of living and living as thing, as Asian women are subject to, according to Cheng. So looking closely at the aesthetics of Asian femininity, Cheng uses the term yellow woman to describe an object person living as an aesthetic being. Of course, by using the color yellow, Cheng is limiting her argument to Asian women who might feel seen under this color, mostly East Asian women, leaving us to wonder about the specificities of being South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, or Asian in brown, black, or white. I think every study has its limits, and while I'd be eager to think about non-yellow experiences of ornamentalism, it's worth turning to Cheng as we approach my answer to the question at hand. So she writes, neither mere flesh nor mere thing, the yellow woman straddling the person-thing divide applies tremendous pressures on politically treasured notions of agency, feminist enfleshment, and human ontology. What we need then is not just an account of how Asiatic people have been used as things, or how Oriental things have influenced our uses of them, but instead a conceptual paradigm that can accommodate the deeper, stranger, more intricate, and more ineffable confusion between thingness and personness, instantiated by Asiatic femininity in its unpredictable object life. Ornamentalism engages racial abstraction to make the claim that yes, objects and materials are racialized, but objects and materials can also racialize people. And it's worth noting here that the word sounds and looks an awful lot like Orientalism, Edward Said's critique of the West, the Occident, and its representation of the East, the Orient, as exotic, excessive, weak, feminine. So in developing the theory of ornamentalism, Cheng isn't simply trying to kind of combine a history of the ornamentality with Orientalism. Rather, she zeroes in on the racialized and feminized logic of ornamentalism to argue that thus far, our efforts to make sense of race have failed to take seriously the making of race. Ornamentalism would want us to ask how the synthetic and aesthetic process of fusing bone and flesh, like one does when mixing kaolin and batoons for porcelain, offers answers for understanding the making of the Asian race and the yellow woman in particular. In a chapter titled Blue Willow, Chang opens with a discussion on China through the looking glass, a 2015 exhibition at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art featuring over 140 pieces of mostly European high fashion and haute couture. The exhibit, in Chang's eyes, rehearsed for the 21st century audience the basic tenets of 19th century Orientalism, that opulence and sensuality are the signature components of Asiatic character, that Asia is always ancient, excessive, feminine, decadent, that Asia, and China in particular, equals ornament. So if we allow ourselves to be pulled in by porcelain's signature shine, we come to notice how clay molds into a kind of looking glass, reflecting a mirror image of the Asian race, both translucent and opaque. If porcelain had a race, surely it would be the race of the yellow woman, which is Asian. Porcelain's luster coats yellow flesh, but there is something different that emerges when we pay close attention to Dachek's work in particular. What happens when the Asianness of porcelain, of Dachek, of myself, also bears a history of whiteness? How does the theory of ornamentalism shift when considering the vexed history of porcelain as an Asian and white commodity? Chang teaches us how to read the contours of Asian femininity and the alternative narrative of the modern Western subject that it charts, where race is not only made on and with the skin, but through the trade and production and aestheticization of things. But what Dachek forces us to confront is the peculiar condition of being not either person or thing, Asian or white, but something else, something like both. The ornamental dimensions of Asian femininity as vitrified by porcelain may reveal yellow as a surface skin, but to be able to speak of the race of porcelain, binaries fail us again. Porcelain, to answer the question of this talk, is not Asian or white, but both. If porcelain had a race, that race would be mixed, Asian with white. In Tie, Catch, and Married, Dachek presents a sequence of 3 porcelain wall mounts, each adorned with hooks made of chicken feet, molded from porcelain. Draped delicately over the chicken feet are knotted handkerchiefs drenched in liquid porcelain. The chicken feet stand in for Dachek's mother and her Chinese heritage. Dipped in porcelain, they also stand in for his father and his whiteness. The handkerchiefs catches symbolic tears shed as a result of her estranged relationship from them. And as a whole, the porcelain wall mounts encase the layered histories of intergenerational conflict that condition her body and permeate the history of the porcelain trade. So here, porcelain functions as both an ode to Chinese heritage, as well as a meditation on the allure of porcelain white or light skin. Less than an identity, white represents an inheritance, an ancestral marking. By casting chicken feet and fabric into porcelain, cultural delicacy and Asian femininity are cross-referenced as both woman and commodity. I see this occur most vividly in Catch, with the drenched fabric suspended by a porcelain-encrusted chicken foot and cascading down from the ceramic wall mount. The vintage handkerchiefs in the Chinese delicacy are whitewashed by porcelain. The knots tangle to secure this whitening. Firing edible tissue into a porcelain thing, the artist invites an exploration into the forms of relation that unravel when we consider feet as porcelain, feeling as fabric, skin as color, the subject as object, the person as thing. Chicken feet are also present in Half, the cornerstone in Dachek's 2012 exhibition Clean and Bleed. In what is a pair of 2 porcelain powder puffs, Half is a hand-built sculpture now part of the permanent collection at Houston's Museum of Fine Arts. On the left, we see a blue and white patterned puff with purchased black human hair. On the right, an unmarked puff with hair from her father's blonde toupee. Each handle is made of a porcelain molded chicken foot. Together, the Chinese patterns on the left and the blonde hair on the right allude to the formation of a biracial subject, The puffs, used to conceal faults on the skin, deliver a flawless rendition of Porcelain's race, both Asian and white. So now that we have our answer, let's think about its implications. What we're faced with is the racial ideology of racial mixture, which is a fraught theoretical tension, as well as a lived experience, a set of very different lived experiences. In our contemporary moment, racial mixture is more or less celebrated as a sign that racial progress has been made. What once was legally forbidden is now increasingly more common, if not kind of normal. I think the logic goes something like two people of different races loved each other so much that they produced kin, and refusing the racist past where that love was forbidden. So I think there's a lot of assumptions with this narrative that interracial relationships are ones that result in children, that they are heterosexual, that they are consensual, and there's a lot of erasures too, like how mixed race people might experience unique forms of racism, that they might not have enough, that they might feel inauthentic in whatever space they navigate, or that they might take up too much space in conversations about race. But more often than not, racial mixture today is understood as a sign that things are changing, even in spite of its kind of like current being under threat, at least the concept of interracial marriage. So this is a sign that things are changing, that barriers are being broken, that communities are intermingling, and that in a few decades we'll have mixed ourselves out of the race problem. Historically, of course, things are quite different. The idea of racial mixture was operationalized as a scientific discourse developed through settler colonial notions of racial purity, leftovers from racist science. Both racial categorization and racial hybridity are grounded in the idea that race is biological, resulting in the fabrication of race into a eugenic knowledge object, utilized to discourage heterosexual interracial sex for the purposes of preserving Eurocentric notions of white superiority and purity. It was under such circumstances that racial mixture became inherent to the logics of genocidal conquest, racial slavery, imperialist war. Racial mixture was not only the taboo consequence of the forbidden interracial relationship, but it was also a strategy used to whiten non-white races through the reproductive labor of women of color who would birth children from white colonizers, settlers, or servicemen. So racial mixture not only became the central narrative in eugenic narratives and efforts to preserve the boundaries between races or to whiten non-white races, but it has also been used as evidence nowadays supporting the myth that the harms of the racist past have been relieved through the growing demographics of mixed race people alone. But indeed, the numbers are rising. Since the turn of the century, when after years of deliberation, the United States Census finally decided to create a check more than one box, the US Census, there's been a steady increase in mixed race citizens, where mixed race Asian and white people in particular function as what scholar Cynthia Nakashima articulates as servants of culture, or children of the future, who will usher the nation into a new, more colorful sort of melting pot, where racial groups do not separate and segregate, but marry and have babies. Projections of census data for upcoming decades coincides with predictions seen in popular publications that many of us might see as familiar, such as the National Geographic 2013 special issue on the changing face of America, which projected that by 2050, the average American will be mixed race. We're almost there. This projection, of course, has been made before. You might also recall Time magazine's prominent 1993 issue, The New Face of America, which features, interestingly, a digitized woman, an artificial human of multiracial descent on the cover and a tagline, "How Immigrants Are Shaping the World's First Multicultural Society." Eve, the computer-generated figure on Time's 1993 cover, has become the avatar representing a move away from the past peril of interraciality towards the contemporary moment's celebratory rise in multiracial citizens. So out of this growth, though, mixed-race Asian and white people in particular are met with a peculiar enchantment. Across the global stage, Asian people with white heritage, and I'd be happy in the Q&A to talk about actual figures, many of whom might be kind of popular and contemporary discourse. How Asian people with white heritage are heralded as harbingers of a more cosmopolitan future, as they are thought to embody the best of both worlds, the kind of fortitude of the Occident and the sensuality of the Orient, if you will. We see this narrative spelled out quite literally on this 2001 cover of Time magazine Asia. In a striking parallel to Time's The New Face of America, this cover features 3 Eurasian entertainers and a tagline that reads, "All mixed up, half Asian, half Caucasian, and 100% cool. Why Eurasians are the new face of Asia." By referring to Eurasians as the poster children for 21st century globalization, Time magazine Asia parallels Time USA's direct attention to the mixed race face, and that the role that face plays in shaping the future. But it goes further, identifying the future of the so-called Asian century with the Eurasian face. So it becomes strikingly clear that mixed race people can be projected as the future so long as whiteness is involved in the equation. So to this point, when faced with the biological, political, and cultural history of racial mixture, it is reasonable to note the propensity for whiteness to linger at the center. It is certainly the case that too often with discourse on racial mixture, there is a tendency to prioritize the narratives of those mixed with white, to which this talk is not at all immune. As a result, some people have thought to decenter whiteness and uplift the voices of those who are biracial without having white ancestry. This endeavor to know more about the subjugated histories, imagined futures, and aesthetic alliances across non-white multiracial diasporas is necessary and pressing. However, as politically as I might align with the desire to decenter whiteness, I likewise fear that by casting whiteness to the margins without also acknowledging its central role in the structural formation of racial mixture is to come short of an understanding of how race is made. We kind of have to reckon with it. So to fully understand the phenomenon of racialization, specifically multiracialism, we must come to terms with race's shifting forms and the role that whiteness plays in that reorganization of power. The legacy of trade, resettlement, anti-miscegenation laws, the one-drop rule of hypodescent, mestizaje, and the documentation of indigeneity through blood quantum mark a path for interrogating the subject of racial mixture alongside the logics of whiteness. Rather than linger on the mixed race future then, what if instead we turned our perspective in the other direction, towards its past? It's no secret that Asian people with white heritage are marked by an imperial history of movement and displacement, which repeatedly places Asian and white people, Asian and white bodies in close proximity, so close, in fact, that they touch, and sometimes through that touching, they're thought to meld. But turning to the past, in my eyes, I'm not a historian. It doesn't necessitate embarking on a historical hunt through archives to find mixed-race stories from the past that have not yet been told. I wonder instead what it would mean to take an object like porcelain and imagine the racial life that extends from it. If porcelain had a race, and if it were to be mixed, then let us not forget that an object holds a history. And the history of both racial mixture and porcelain brings us to a multitude of geopolitical locations. Porcelain's race, and race in general, contrary to popular belief, cannot be thoroughly reckoned with through a DNA test. And herein lies an important lesson. What if looking to the racial past through objects was not an observation of lineage, but a practice of intimacy? And here, when I say intimacy, I'm thinking of Professor Lisa Lowe, who takes up intimacy as a heuristic, a guide. It's not just about thinking about sexual or kind of community relations among people, but it's actually a guide to observe the often obscured connections between Europe and the emergence of liberalism, the Americas and settler colonialism, Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, and Asia and the global industry of trade. Lowe looks at these distinct areas of the world and the people who live there, but rather than study them as disparate or disconnected, she tracks the ways they are brought into intimate proximity with each other. And in doing so, she offers a useful model to disrupt the incomplete handlings of the past, so that when we think about racial mixture, for instance, we don't get bogged down by the literal mixedness between races, but through an intimacy with the past, we come to witness the ways racial difference animates a much larger story about power and resistance too. So one way that I've discussed this concept of intimacy with my students is by thinking about intimacy in terms of saturation. Saturation, which is commonly understood as the state in which no more of something can be absorbed. Another way to put it, however, is that saturation is an ethics of witnessing what it means to hold in as much as possible. Saturation, as worked through by Professor C. Riley Snorton and Hentai Yap, not only describes the sensory, but also brings to the fore the methods, approaches, and structures that come to bear on how sensations are felt and embodied. So along these lines, saturation is an extension of what performance theorist Jose Munoz calls sensuous contemplation, a mode of saying and doing that makes one conscious of the actual material conditions of reality, the contingencies that structure the world and organize power. Porcelain is saturated in a history of trade, capital, and cultural possession, but it is also saturated with the potential to contest the racialized and gendered nature of its object life. There is a lot of tension here in racial abstraction, in living as thing, in cross-cultural intimacy, and in being mixed race itself, which to me is an experience of becoming conditioned by the convergence of multiple racial histories that are clashing within one body, not unlike what we see in Half. In addition to its beauty, with Half, Dacek Yu has shown us one way to potentially alleviate these tensions. By bringing all sides of us to the fore, confronting our edges, our limits, our thingness, perhaps we're reminded that reckoning with racial tension is not confined to public, large-scale movements, but is also an everyday thing, where energy may be sourced by paying attention to the very things that get us through each day, like a powder puff, a mirror, or even a porcelain-encrusted cultural delicacy. Thank you. How are we on time? Good.
I have a mic in case anyone has a question since we're streaming this. So. Thank you so much, Anna. Oh, we have a streaming question. Hold on. Oh, never mind.
Hi, thank you for that. I have a question about, I was invested in the way that you were kind of holding historical, theoretical, and artistic sources kind of in equal measure. And as an artist and being in an art center, I'm curious if you have any reflections on like the rewards of the ways that art objects might be able to hold theory or materialize theory in ways that are unique compared to, I don't know, text or historical documents.
I mean, first, I think it's kind of fun to work through this, and I mean, I like puzzles, and so I think that by thinking about race and embodiment writ large through objects, not only returns us to this concept of objectivity, which I feel like is one of the first ways that many of us come to understand ourselves, through the ways in which we are expected through gender roles, through racial expectations to kind of function in the world. So it actually offers a really useful way to kind of bring the punchline home, to see the everyday realities without, in a way that's not as explicit to the ways that we're actually used to. So I think oftentimes having a conversation about violence oftentimes leads us to think about how violence is this very brute physical thing, but violence is also held, saturated within these objects. And so to actually try to think about the reasons why, it illuminates this larger history, which I feel like is the only truly thorough way that we can understand race, gender, sexuality, and difference, by thinking about it in relation to other races, other genders, other sexualities, because it I think necessitates this comparative work. I mean, I think that working at the nexus between art, academia, and kind of cultural texts is is so fun, but it's hard sometimes to think about the ways that you think about translation. But at the end of the day, when you turn to objects, I mean, the laughter that emerged, maybe it was a discomforting laughter with the cars image, right? I think that's something that actually allows a lot of interesting work to be done, and so it's a useful pedagogical tool for me. Thank you for the question.
Okay, coming.
Okay. I was thinking about the conversation we were having at lunch about other mixed race Asians, and we were kind of being really critical of them. And then later on, when I was walking back here, I felt really bad about that, because I think as someone who navigates half or both, the way we were talking about them was expecting them to fulfill some version of whole. So can you talk about some of your present day research and some of the kind of mixed race Asian celebrities that we see representation in, but also see extreme flaws?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, there's so many instances. I don't know if anyone follows Emily Mariko, who's an influencer. I think she's kind of someone who's really, you can TikTok, Instagram her, but she's an instance where people have thought about ways that one can actually think about incorporating their cultural heritage in a way that has been for the common good. She has created this really iconic lunch, a leftover lunch where one makes salmon and rice, right? So she's like doing something good for the world, I guess. I have other thoughts I can share with you about her after. But there's a lot of cases, I think, God, was it April? Or it was some time ago, no more than maybe 2 months ago, when Vanessa Hudgens was seen on a stage with Bongbong Marcos, the new president of the Philippines. And she was donned in traditional cultural Filipina attire and is kind of welcomed as the new global tourism ambassador to this person who, of course, Vanessa Hudgens, right? But when you're alongside a president, what happens when you show kind of or maybe like an erasure of a certain type of imperial past? And so that conversation about, or that feeling bad, is one that I try to source through, at least for me, when I think about people like Elliot Rodger, who is the so-called incel hero. He went on the shooting rampage off the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara, back in 2014. Daniel Holtzclaw, who is a cop who's currently serving a 263-year sentence for assaulting at least 13 black women while he was on duty as a police officer for the Oklahoma City Police Department. All of these people are Asian people, mostly with Asian mothers and white fathers. And I don't mean to say that we're all terrible, that we're fated for violence, but I do think there's something that happens when one maybe is able to pass and is able to perform, or is maybe expected to perform a certain type of whiteness. So it's less that I'm trying to say you're being white, be more Asian because Asian is good. Because of course there's bad people of all races and walks of life. But I do think that there's something that happens when we think about the Time Magazine Asia cover, when we think about how Asian people who oftentimes are mixed with white are seen to be as exotic and beautiful. What happens when we're when we're said to be good, the world, the culture tells us we're doing something beneficial just by existing, when in actuality, we, like everyone else, needs to actually think about the histories that we carry. Not to say that it's our fault or to say that we are somehow to blame for things that previous generations have done, but I do think it's important to think about the ways that these histories really do kind of impact our bodies. Like, we literally inherit them. The ways I think that we stand, the ways that we sit in a chair, how your body maneuvers around a room. These are things that are taught to us, and not only they're embodiments that are taught to us through us living, they're things that we think through and kind of carry over time. So I do think that the bullying that might be a source in that feeling I try to think about, well, I want to surround myself with folks who are not racist or not sexist, and maybe also have like certain types of politics that I admire, like maybe people who are kind. And so when I note violence through certain types of cases, I'm not trying to say again that we're fated or indebted to a certain type of violence, but I think it's an invitation to say we all are unfortunately very capable of hurting people, and we all have also been hurt. And so what does it mean to actually think about the ways that racial tensions surround us all? And I think what's so interesting about your work, Jennifer, is that you show ways that you can actually like feel that tension and potentially also relieve it.
Oh, coming.
Thank you so much for giving this lecture. I've been trying to figure out how to phrase this question because, so I grew up in Alabama, and in the Southeast, what is very kind of apparent in nature is kudzu, which is like not from this, America is from the Southeast and Southeast Asia. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how like porcelain being this object that is in its nature like controllable in its making process, compared to something that was similarly taken and brought over to America, that is also kind of antiquated and like it's seen as this negative thing, when it's not. It's like medicinal and nutritious and very, very good, but it's uncontrollable in its nature. Like the comparison between these two different objects.
That's so fun. I mean, I've actually been looking into that because I'm writing about Joanna Gaines, and I'm trying to think about the magnolia. And like, is it similar to like this? I mean, is it a vine?
It's an invasive vine.
Invasive vine. So I've been thinking a lot about biology in some way. It makes me think a lot about the distinctions between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation, and thinking through the kind of travels and journeys between objects. I think food is such an easy way for us to track things, right? Like, actually, in Leslie Bowe's work, she writes about how she's someone who teaches at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and she teaches Introduction to Asian American Studies to a mostly white student audience. And her students would oftentimes say how excited they were to take the class because they had Thai last night for dinner, or they have an Asian partner, or they love BTS, right? So like the consumption of culture and the way it travels, not even just geographically, but also through the internet, airwaves, is one that I think it brings up a lot of conversation that usually ends up within good or bad. Like, oh, you're good because you like something different than your own culture, or you're being so fetishy and weird. Why are you obsessed with another group's culture? So I think it's fun to have the conversations.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for giving us such a really well put together understanding of how an object or a material would start to have this connotation of race. I guess one of the things that I quickly thought about this was, if we get to understanding porcelain as being something that's half white and half Asian, do I need to think about treating it differently? Right? Does my reverence for that as a material, clay, or finished object, do I need to think about how I approach that in a different way?
That's such a great question. I think that how do you treat porcelain right now? Right?
In a lot of different ways. I mean, I could go on and on, but maybe that's not are you asking me to?
No, I mean, I think it's just a question of maybe what is the urge behind the question to think about if something is mixed race. I mean, ultimately, I think, again, I'm not trying to ascribe porcelain a racial identity. I think if is a very important word in the title of the talk. I think mostly it's about thinking about oneself and the way that I was having a conversation about racial abstraction that led me to think about myself and the unique ways that a material could represent me. But I also don't think that porcelain represents me because I'm not Chinese. I'm Filipina, right? But it's still like, oh, what does it mean to look like someone who might be represented by this thing? And so the conversations about racial abstraction that I find most exciting are, again, ones that get us to think about what is it that we do with our objects, and not even literal objects, but the objects of desire, the things that we can't actually hold and touch, which are oftentimes ourselves, like the depths of ourselves, and the ways that the way we navigate the world is oftentimes not in our control. We might try to and so you might think, porcelain would, if it was maybe white before or Asian before, and it's now this other thing, what would its use be? So would it be something that would be utilized as a form of defense, as a form of offense, as a form of protection, as a gift? Who would you be bestowing the object to? I'll have to think about that question more, but thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more. Or that might be the last. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Anna. Thanks everyone for coming.